Hello, my name is Dr. John Rees. I'm a chiropractor based in Ilkley in West Yorkshire. And if you've been kind enough to be following any of the videos I've done recently, the most recent related to COVID. And I felt there was a compunction and a professional courtesy required from someone like myself to inform you of information that you may or may not know, but I thought if I put it out there, it may clarify a few issues or ratify and confirm a few things. So in the last video, part 1, we discussed COVID, the vaccines particularly, and hopefully that was informative. In this one, we're going to focus predominantly on America as opposed to the UK, but the incidents that occurred really all focused on the States. And I'm going to show you a chart here which illustrates the breakdown of the various departments in the States that relate to health and vaccines and medicines and what have you. And you'll see here that the sort of overarching thing, the same as we have in the UK, is the Department of Health. In the States, they call it the Department of Health and Human Sciences. And it has 13 divisions. Now, we're only going to focus on 3 here, which is the FDA, the CDC, and the NIH. Now, the FDA is the Food and Drug Agency, and that itself has 21 subdivisions to cover the health and regulations of food and drugs sold in the USA and the drugs administered. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, that has 25 agencies in the USA, and that's the main role of the CDC is to protect the US population from the health and safety threats from home and abroad. And the final one we're going to talk about today is the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. And it has 21 institutes, so 21 subdivisions. And the one that we're going to be most focusing on today is the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the NIAID, all these acronyms. Now, if we look at the NIAID particularly, that has, the NIAID, it has 20 different areas of focus covering influenza, asthma, radiation and nuclear countermeasures, enteric diseases, fundamental immunology, immune-mediated disease, malaria and other tropical disease, sexually transmitted infections, as well as the 5 we're going to focus on here. Now, the reason we're going to focus on the NIAID is in relation to Dr. Anthony Fauci. And those who have done some research into COVID and the ongoing situation would have come across him, and he's definitely had some influence in his time, and he's also come under a lot of criticism by various people in the Senate and Congress, particularly those from the Republican Party. But historically, Dr. Fauci, he joined the NIAID in the early 1980s, I believe, and he became the head of the NIAID in 1984, and he stayed there until 2022. So, of course, he was around for a number of different incidents, and including what has been called the pandemic. One of Fauci's first acts, let's say, is he realized that public health departments around the world were sort of losing their purpose because there wasn't a national or international health issue. And there hadn't been for many, many years. In actual fact, since sanitation and clean water had proliferated since the 1920s, the incidence of public health concerns had much reduced. To some extent, also, the presence of some vaccines also assisted, but predominantly public health issues were not of concern as because of sanitation and general sort of cleanliness had increased in the last century. So, bearing in mind, he wanted to protect his public health department as the NIAID was. He said, I understand at the conference, but he has been reported as saying that, this is back in the late 70s, early 80s, that the world needed a crisis. And then AIDS came along. Now, there are lots and lots of different opinions about AIDS, but there is some alleged evidence that Fauci used the AIDS situation, whatever you want to define that as an opportunity to scare the world and basically get public health back on the headline pages, if you like, and lots of money was therefore put to fund research for AIDS, etc., etc., etc. Now, interestingly, in relation to AIDS, there has never, ever actually been a virus found. There was a lady who did a lot of research, sort of in the outback in Australia, away from public scrutiny, who did a lot of research, and she came up with a very categoric stipulation that the AIDS as a virus doesn't exist. And also, it's known that in different parts of the world, the term AIDS has many different definitions. It has a massively different definition whether you're in the north of the American border in Canada or south of the American border in America. So that's a questionable thing. Anyway, Fauci did very well out of the situation, and also he sanctioned the use of many drugs that were questionable, I understand, from certain people. But also there are many doctors around the sort of that peak start of AIDS who wanted to use off-label medications. Now, off-label medications are medications that have been trialed for use in certain circumstances, but through the doctor's knowledge, that they believe that they can be used in combination with other medications for a particular scenario. And many doctors, GPs around the States in particular, had stated that certain off-label medications used as a combination would be very beneficial for patients suffering with what we know as the AIDS situation. Because ostensibly, those people had for a number of different reasons, they had an immune system which was sort of much reduced, and therefore they caught and became very ill and oftentimes died of things like pneumonia from small infections and small viruses and small bacteria that the vast majority of us who weren't immunosuppressed would not fall foul of, and we'd survive. And it's believed, or it's alleged, that a number of the early deaths from what we know to be AIDS is because at the time Dr. Fauci would not sanction the use of off-label medication. Now, one of the other departments that is within the NIAID is the Vaccine Development Department. And Fauci, together with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, attempted to roll out a number of different trials in Africa, in India, and basically in very suppressed areas. And it's, according to Dr. Robert Kennedy Jr. in his book, The Real Anthony Fauci, he says that a number of the drugs they used weren't licensed to be used at all because the drugs that had been developed for other reasons had been found in early trials to be really quite lethal, and therefore they hadn't been licensed because obviously there's a cost to do it. Basically, there were drugs that were just too deadly, for want of a better term, and therefore, but it would appear that Fauci allowed that to occur. Also, one of the departments within the NIAID, interestingly, is the Biodefense and Emerging Infections department. And basically, this was a department that thought it was necessary to develop vaccines, which they had what was called gain of function. In other words, you'd adapt a vaccine based on the possibility of there being a bioterror weapons used by viruses released by some unpleasant individuals. Fauci caused a lot of money to be used for gain of function, and there were certain institutions in the States initially, I think Johns Hopkins was one of them, and a few others, that were doing this research. Then Congress found out about it and felt uncertain as to the appropriateness of doing this and sanctioned that it couldn't happen. It is alleged, therefore, that the funds that were available via Fauci went to Wuhan, and gain of function continued in Wuhan in China. Another department is the Drug and Research Development, and within Fauci's auspices, and this is or was the biggest funder in the world for drug research. And obviously many researchers would go to this department, go to the NIAID, ask for funding. Fauci had millions, billions available and would often allow it. But I understand there was a degree of animosity with certain individuals, and it was believed you had to keep in his good books to get funded. There is a story about a very reputable cancer researcher who was making great strides with cancer, had never been rejected for any of his funding requests. He criticized Fauci in relation to Fauci's belief as what AIDS was, and then he never got any funding thereafter. And it is stated that that lack of funding over the last 20 years has put back the progress in regards to development of improving issues with cancers quite markedly. And then the final one is the Pandemic Development Office Department within the NIAID. And of course, as we know, Fauci was advisor to many US presidents. He was connected with the WHO, and obviously the WHO connected with China. And Fauci, in his deliberations, was, let's say, he wandered a little bit with what he said from one time to another. Sometimes masks were good, sometimes masks were no need. He was very adamant that there wasn't a lab leak, which we now find is to be the situation. There was discussion about lockdowns. And I think one thing that Robert Kennedy Jr. says in his book is that due to this, the way the system is set up in the States, maybe unique to the States, if you are providing authority for the licensing of a drug, I suppose it depends what's in the contract, but you can benefit and get some percentage from the profits of that drug, which as a regulator seems a little bit obtuse, let's say. So as I say, there are many stories of concern about Dr. Anthony Fauci and what he was doing. Was he the preeminent creator, for want of a better term, of what turned out to be the COVID SARS-2 pandemic? Some would say yes. It's not for us to make a definitive statement here, but he's part of the story, that is for sure. The fact that President Biden, literally minutes before the inauguration of President Trump, gave a unilateral pardon for Fauci and many others, not specifically saying he was pardoned for what, but just like a preemptive pardon, has raised certain questions. So one of the main characters involved and in the catastrophic situation that occurred with regard to COVID is definitely Anthony Fauci, and of course the development of the vaccines and his relationships with Big Pharma is also of question. But we're not going to go into any particular detail there because that would take us another 3 hours to discuss. But yes, an instrumental individual is the least we can say in regards to the events that happened in this country of sort of January, February, March 2020, and was still ongoing a couple of years later. So, before we sign off, we just do a quick synopsis, a quick review of what we've been through on this video. And here we'll just show you that they have the overarching department of the Government of Health and Human Sciences, and there are 13 divisions, separate operating divisions, including the Food and Drug Agency, dealing with what it says there, the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, and also the other one that we've mentioned, more particularly and in more detail, the National Institutes for Health, and that's the one that a subdivision of it, the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, is the one that Dr. Fauci had a fundamental control of. And as we move on here, all we've just done here is put the 5 departments that we focused on in the film that Dr. Fauci has control of. And these are just a short synopsis of what we've said in the previous 15, 20 minutes or so, I imagine. And we'll sort of just leave you to read and review the content there. And as we say, hopefully we will see you for part 3. Okay, so that is part 2. We will soon be doing part 3. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.